Welcome to the Chapter 13 overview of the European Middle Ages. The main idea of Chapter 13 is that many Germanic kingdoms that succeeded the Roman Empire were reunited in the 800s under Charlemagne. And this matters now because Charlemagne was able to spread Christian civilization throughout Northern Europe, where it had a permanent impact. Charlemagne's the first ruler that kind of picked up the pieces and rebuilt what had been lost in 476. Now, there were numerous long-term changes in Western Europe as a result of the collapse of Roman order in the West. The first was the downfall of the Roman infrastructure. The Romans, great city builders and planners on urban civilization, and that tremendous and highly advanced infrastructure that they built fell into ruin in the centuries after the collapse. There was a decline of learning because, of course, education is a luxury, not a necessity. And in a chaotic, violent, anarchic world, the focus was on survival, not on education. The common language of Latin morphed over time into the various Romance languages. The language we speak, English, is a Germanic-Latin hybrid, as we know. There were also legal changes. There was a new concept of government, and a Germanic tribal personal mode of rule replaced the Roman concept of citizenship and legal institutions. It became more of who you knew or who you were related to, as opposed to who you were as a citizen or a non-citizen. Nevertheless, remnants of the Roman legal system did remain in use in Western Europe. Most folks in Western Europe were living a rural lifestyle. The population of the cities dropped, as we shall see. The one solid structure that survived the collapse of Roman power in the West, though, was the Christian church. And it was powerful because it was a unifying social structure that most West Europeans belonged to, were part of in some way. Chapter 13 has about 8 big ideas. We're going to look at them in order very briefly. The first was that after the fall of the Roman Empire, Western Europe was divided into many small kingdoms, while trade, cities, and learning all declined. Now, this map shows in Western Europe the numerous Germanic kingdoms that arose after the collapse of the Romans. And the Angles and the Saxons invaded and occupied Roman Britain. And that's where we get our Germanic-Latin hybrid language of English from. But as you can see, a lot of competing, mutually hostile kingdoms in the West. And a setback in many ways, in political terms, economic terms, and in intellectual terms. This chart shows the drastic population decline that took place in the centuries after the collapse of Roman rule. So the blue bar shows the population of Rome and Lyon and Trier in Germany around the year 100 at the height of Roman power. 8 centuries later, as you can see, a drastic decline. And this is because cities with their high population density can only survive if food is delivered on a regular basis. You need political stability. You need international trade in some cases. But even our cities today, the only reason our cities can function is that every day hundreds of trucks and trains bring hundreds and hundreds of tons of food to our cities. And if that ever stopped, our cities would probably undergo a similar population decline. Second big idea that Chapter 13 investigates or discusses is the role of monasteries. They played an important role in Western Europe. We'll take a look at that. This chart shows what's known as the Benedictine rule. Saint Benedict was an early church leader who instilled a sense of discipline and structure into the monasteries. He created a daily timetable, and as you can see, it was a pretty full day. They got up really early in the morning for a church service, 2 o'clock in the morning, and frequent pausing for religion, for church service or for prayer. They also performed physical labor as well as intellectual labor, so farming and maintenance of the monastery, cleanup, doing the dishes, things like that, along with the hand copying of manuscripts. As this chart shows, monasteries were not only places where monks lived and prayed, they were also places of work and study. Many monasteries, or abbeys, housed self-contained communities that grew their own food and made many of the objects they used. Monks worked in the fields, in workshops, and in scriptoria, or writing rooms, where they copied and decorated manuscripts. This engraving here shows a monk bent over, hard at work, copying a manuscript. And a lot of ancient Greek and Roman writings were preserved thanks to these monasteries. Not all of them, but a large degree, and certainly more than would have survived had these monasteries not gone to this effort. The third big idea that Chapter 13 discusses is the Franks, the Germanic group that conquered Roman Gaul, ultimately giving their name to France, the France as we know it. And some of their key leaders included Charles Martel. He won a key victory and established the Carolingian dynasty, as we'll see. Now, in the 700s, the Moors from Spain, they were Arabs, Muslims, and they controlled most of Spain down here. As you can see, in 714, they invaded into southern France. And they continued that invasion into the 720s. Because they had enjoyed a successful path of invasion here in the 730s, they decided to invade over here in the west. But they were stopped in a key battle in the year 732, the Battle of Tours. As you can see, the Battle of Tours is described as a turning point because it halted the expanse of Islam into Western Europe. This is one of these times that historians always look at in terms of asking what might have been. But a significant victory for the Frankish forces, and it set the stage for the foundation of the Frankish kingdoms. One of the key Frankish leaders after Charles Martel was Charlemagne, and he briefly reunited much of Western Europe in the 800s. This map shows that Frankish kingdom that grew in size after the key victory at the Battle of Tours in the year 732. And the light green here shows the original territory added to by Charles Martel and Pepin, and the dark green areas added by Charlemagne in the 800s. And this was the largest single political entity that had existed for about 4 centuries, since the fall of Roman rule. And because it was stable and viable economically, a lot of progress was made. This chart gives a quick rundown of Charlemagne's achievements while he was emperor. Unified politically, and that's good for the economy. It's good for trade. It makes travel and trade safe. The stability was good for education, and a lot of those monasteries did a lot of key work preserving ancient writings of the Greeks and the Romans. Spreading Christianity, and developing a written legal law code, which combined some of the older Roman aspects with other Germanic legal ideas. Now, there was a rebellion in 799, against the Pope, Pope Leo III, and because Charlemagne helped him out, the Pope crowned Charlemagne Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day. And it was this symbolic notion that the mantle of the Roman Empire had passed to Charlemagne. This shows Charlemagne's empire in the years between 768 and 843, extending Frankish power. Down here in green, you see the Papal States, and that was the territory of Italy headed by the Pope. The Pope's administration is known as the papacy. Now, this was a violent time period in European history, and the fifth big idea that Chapter 13 looks at is the different waves of invasions between 700 and the year 1000, as this next map will show. As you can see from the key, there were a lot of them. Vikings, Muslims, Magyars, who are the Hungarians. A very violent time period in Western European history, and because of that, a time of chaos and anarchy, historians used to refer to the first half of the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages, and certainly in many ways, because of these repeated invasions by different groups, they were dark. Now, feudalism arose in some ways as an answer to the chaos and suffering caused by these different invasions. Feudalism is a system of land ownership and military security. And under feudalism, a king or a lord would have deputies. He'd have vassals, and he would grant them the use of land, and he would promise to protect them. In return, the vassal owed the lord loyalty, political loyalty, military service. He had to perform certain tasks and pay certain fees. It wasn't really a political structure in the sense of the Romans had, but it was based on land ownership and essentially economic security. The land was divided into manors, and the lord of the manor allowed the peasants to use land for farming. He gave the peasants protection. The peasants had some sort of security in a chaotic, anarchic world. In return, most of what the peasants raised as crops went to the lord. In addition to the food crops, they would have to work on the lord's lands, and they would have to pay certain fees. This structure of feudalism kind of had a place for everybody and everybody in their place, with the king at the apex of the pyramid, church officials and the nobility, knights, and down at the bottom, peasants of various types performing most of the heavy physical labor. But it's based on a relationship of obligation and service, and it's a social structure. It did provide security in a very violent and unpredictable time. This chart shows a traditional English manor, and you can see the different divisions of the land. The manor house, where the lord would live with his servants. The village church occupying a prominent place as well. Peasant cottages down here. The lord would own a lot of the good land, and the peasants would work it for the lord. He would keep most of the crops. A small amount of land was set aside for the peasants to raise their own crops in gardens, things like that. The lord owned a mill where peasants could have their grain ground into flour for a fee. There was common pasture land to graze cattle and a woodland where firewood would be gathered. So a self-contained community with a hierarchy. Knights were a key feature, as you saw on that social diagram. Knights were expected to follow a code of behavior known as chivalry, and much was made of this chivalrous behavior in songs and in stories. Now, the code of chivalry was an idealized set of rules and behavior that knights were expected to follow. They were supposed to display courtesy and fairness, religious faith, and devotion to honor. The word chivalry comes from the French word for horse. And chivalry literally means really the code of the horseman. It was the nobles who rode horses, and only they had the training and the wealth to take care of horses. Peasants walked. As you can see, it says here, in the feudal system, a knight swore his oath of loyalty to his lord, and the oath helped form a basis for the ideals of chivalry. Now, a chivalrous knight owed and promised loyalty and service to the church, to his lord, to his lady, and to the weak. And ideally, a knight would live up to these things. It wasn't always the case, but that was the idea. A final idea that chapter 13 discusses is the role of the Roman Catholic Church. It had a lot of power because it was the only institution, essentially, in Western Europe that survived the fall of the Roman Empire. The church had a big role, not only in daily life, where there was really mandatory religious observance. The church was the sole dispenser of the various sacraments that one needed if one expected to get into the Christian heaven. There were a lot of religious feast days and saints' days. The church did, in addition to organizing monasteries and abbeys, they did organize hospitals, and certain monasteries and certain orders of monks devoted their lives to taking care of the weak and the poor and the sick and the elderly. They also served, ideally, as a source of moral inspiration for people in their lives. The church had a great deal of economic power because they were a big landowner, and they had power not just over the poor, they had power over the rich because the rich also wanted to get into the Christian heaven, and the only way to get into it was through the church. Economic power translating into political power. Remember, the popes claimed to be infallible. They claimed to be superior to kings, and they could hold the kings accountable. They could threaten to excommunicate the king, cut the king off from the sacraments. If the king was still rebelling or objecting to the authority of the Pope could threaten a kingdom with the interdict. That would be an entire kingdom being excommunicated. That put a lot of pressure on kings because peasants wanted to go to heaven, knights wanted to go to heaven, nobles wanted to go to heaven, and kings were under a lot of pressure to obey what the Pope told them to do. The church could raise their own armies. There were a lot of high-ranking clergy, bishops, and cardinals serving in various monarchies. In addition to the economic and political power, the church also could claim a certain moral authority. And it was this combination of factors that gave the Roman Catholic Church a tremendous amount of power in Western Europe throughout the Middle Ages. One of the themes of the Middle Ages is the constant tension between popes and kings. And that idea gets pursued further in chapter 14, as we shall see.